I moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago. It wasn't anything fancy, just a quiet cul-de-sac in a sleepy suburban town. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other from their driveways but didn't pry into your business. Exactly what I was looking for. At first, everything seemed perfect. My house was cozy, my neighbors polite, and the street was quiet enough that I could leave my windows open at night without hearing more than a distant hum of traffic. But then I noticed the man across the street. His house was older than the others, a bit rundown with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. He was always there, standing on his porch or sitting in an old metal chair near the driveway. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something off about him. He never waved, never smiled, just stared. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I'd glance over while watering my plants or getting the mail and catch him watching me. He didn't try to hide it. His eyes would follow me as I moved, unblinking, his face blank and unreadable. I told myself it was harmless, that maybe he was just lonely or curious about the new neighbor. But then things started to escalate. It began with small things. I'd wake up in the morning to find my garbage cans tipped over or strange marks on the driveway, scratches in the concrete, like someone had dragged something heavy across it. I didn't think much of it at first. Neighborhood kids, maybe. Animals. But one night, I heard something outside my bedroom window. It was faint, like footsteps on the grass. I froze, straining to hear over the hum of my fan. The sound stopped, and I told myself it was just the wind. But when I peeked out the window, I saw him. The man from across the street was standing on my lawn. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, his hands at his sides, staring up at my window. The moonlight cast long shadows across his face, making his features look sharper, more hollow. My heart raced as I ducked out of sight, my hand shaking as I grabbed my phone. I didn't call the police. I wasn't even sure what I'd say. Instead, I stayed curled up in bed, wide-eyed and sleepless, until the sun came up. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, he was gone. The next day, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he had a reason for being out there. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I started locking my doors and windows obsessively, double-checking them before bed. I put up blackout curtains in my bedroom so I wouldn't have to see him, or let him see me. For a while, it seemed to work. I didn't see him on my lawn again, and the strange noises stopped. But then the notes started. I found the first one tucked under my windshield wiper. It was just a piece of lined notebook paper, folded into a neat square. Inside, written in shaky handwriting, were 4 words, "You should be careful." I stared at the note, my stomach twisting. It didn't feel like a threat exactly, but it wasn't comforting either. I looked around the street, half expecting to see him watching me, but the cul-de-sac was empty. I tried to shake it off, but the notes kept coming. One was left on my doorstep, another slipped through the slot in my mailbox. Each one had a similar message, always vague, always unsettling. They're watching you. Don't trust anyone. It's not safe here. I didn't know what to do. If I went to the police, what would I say? That my creepy neighbor was leaving me cryptic notes. They'd probably laugh me out of the station. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to confront him, demand he leave me alone. I waited until just before sunset, when the street was quiet and his porch light was already flickering on. I crossed the street, my heart pounding, and knocked on his door. It took a long time for him to answer. When he finally did, the door creaked open just a few inches, and he peered out at me with those same unblinking eyes. Up close, he looked even older than I'd thought, his face lined with deep wrinkles, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the doorframe. "Yes," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I swallowed hard. "I want you to stop," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "The notes, the staring, I don't know what your problem is, but it needs to stop." For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he opened the door wider. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to help you." Before I could respond, he stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. "I can explain everything," he said. "But you need to see it for yourself." Every instinct I had screamed at me to walk away, to go back to my house and lock the door. But there was something in his voice, something desperate and almost fearful, that made me pause. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The inside of his house was exactly what I'd expected, dim, cluttered, and stale. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic, like old coins. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the fading daylight, and the only illumination came from a single flickering lamp in the corner. Papers were scattered everywhere, on the furniture, on the floor, pinned to the walls. Newspaper clippings, photographs, handwritten notes. "What is all this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he shuffled to a chair near the window and gestured for me to sit on the couch. I hesitated but eventually sat down, the cushions sagging beneath me. "They've been watching this neighborhood for years," he said, his eyes darting toward the window as if he expected someone to be standing there. "Most people don't notice. Or they convince themselves it's nothing. But it's not nothing." "What are you talking about?" I said, my patience wearing thin. He reached for a stack of photos on the coffee table and handed them to me. The images were grainy, taken at night, but they were clear enough to make my skin crawl. They showed people, figures, standing in the shadows around the cul-de-sac. By the trees, near the streetlights, even behind fences. Their faces were obscured, but their presence was unmistakable. "These are from your yard," he said, pointing to one photo in particular. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. The image showed someone standing near my bedroom window, their face turned toward the glass. It was blurry, but their outline was disturbingly familiar, tall, thin, with an almost inhuman stillness. "That could be anyone," I said, though my voice wavered. "A prank, maybe. A kid from the neighborhood." He shook his head. "It's not a prank. It's them. They come at night, watching, waiting. They've been targeting you ever since you moved in." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why me?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But it's always someone new. They pick a house, a person. They watch them, follow them. And then, they move on." His words hung heavy in the air. I wanted to argue, to dismiss him as a paranoid old man, but the photos in my hand told a different story. I couldn't deny what I was seeing. And deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. "Why didn't you call the police?" I asked. He laughed bitterly. "The police. They don't care. They think I'm crazy. I've tried, but they don't see what I see." I stood up, my legs shaky. "I shouldn't have come here. I think you need help, but—" "You think I'm crazy," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "But you've seen them, haven't you? You felt them watching." I froze. The truth was, I had. The uneasy feeling I'd been brushing off for weeks, the sense that I was being watched, it all came rushing back. "Go home if you want," he said, his voice softer now. "But they'll come back. And when they do, you'll wish you'd listened." I left his house without another word, my head spinning. As I stepped outside, the rain started to fall, light at first but quickly growing heavier. The street was empty, the cul-de-sac eerily quiet except for the sound of water hitting the pavement. I hurried across the street, glancing over my shoulder more times than I'd like to admit. The old man was still on his porch, watching me, his expression unreadable. Back in my house, I locked the door and double-checked every window. I told myself the old man was just paranoid, that the photos could have been staged. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing by my window. That night, I woke to a sound. It was faint at first, like someone tapping on the glass. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The room was pitch dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. The tapping came again, louder this time. It was coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone and crept out of bed, every step feeling like it took an eternity. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as I approached the living room. My fingers trembled as I turned on the flashlight app, casting a narrow beam of light across the room. The window was empty. No one was there. I let out a shaky breath, lowering the phone. Maybe it was a branch, I thought. The storm had picked up again, and the wind could have been knocking something against the glass. But then I saw it. A shadow moved across the yard, darting toward the back of the house. It was fast, almost too fast, but I caught just enough of it to know it wasn't my imagination. My phone buzzed in my hand, the sudden vibration making me jump. A text from an unknown number lit up the screen. "Behind you." I spun around, my flashlight swinging wildly, but the room was empty. The tapping started again, this time from the back door. My breath caught in my throat as I approached it, my phone shaking in my hand. Through the glass, I could see a figure standing in the yard. It wasn't the old man. It wasn't anyone I recognized. They were tall and still, their face obscured by the shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me. And then they smiled. Before I could react, the lights in the house flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. When I first moved into the small brick house on Maple Street, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It was quiet, affordable, and close enough to work that I wouldn't have to battle morning traffic. The neighbors seemed nice, too, polite smiles and friendly waves when I brought over boxes. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. The house next door, though, was different. It was larger than mine, with ivy crawling up the sides and an overgrown yard that seemed like no one had touched it in years. The man who lived there, Mr. Grayson, was older, maybe in his late 60s, with gray hair that fell into his eyes and a hunched posture that made him look smaller than he was. I'd catch him watching me sometimes, from his porch or one of the upstairs windows. He never waved or smiled, just stared. At first, I chalked it up to harmless curiosity, new neighbor, new face, maybe he was just nosy. But there was something about the way he looked at me that made my skin crawl, like he was studying me, trying to memorize every detail. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe I was imagining things. But then the knocking started. It happened late one night, around 11 p.m. I was curled up on the couch, halfway through a glass of wine in an episode of some true crime show, when I heard it, a soft knock at the back door. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again. 3 steady taps, faint but deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding. No one should have been back there. The gate to the backyard was locked, and I hadn't invited anyone over. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the kitchen, flipping on the light. The back door was locked, the blinds drawn, but the knock came again. My hand hovered over the doorknob as I debated whether to call out. Finally, I mustered enough courage to speak. "Who's there?" No answer. I peeked through the blinds, but the porch light didn't reveal much, just the empty yard, the shadows of the trees swaying in the breeze. The knock didn't come again, and after a few minutes, I convinced myself it was probably just the wind or some kid playing a prank. But when I checked the lock on the gate the next morning, it was broken. The latch hung loosely, the screws twisted and bent, as if someone had forced it open. Things got stranger after that. I started noticing little changes around the house. Lights I knew I'd turned off were suddenly on when I came home. The curtains in the living room would be open, even though I always closed them before bed. And then there was the smell, a faint, musty odor that seemed to linger in the corners of the house, no matter how much I cleaned. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it again. The knock. This time it was louder, more insistent, and it was coming from the front door. I grabbed the pepper spray I kept in my nightstand and tiptoed to the window. Pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside, I saw him. Mr. Grayson. He was standing on my porch, his face pale in the glow of the porch light. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on the door. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his hands hanging limply at his sides. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That my elderly neighbor was acting strange? It didn't feel like enough. Instead, I opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain latched. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. For a moment, he just stared at me, his eyes darting to the gap in the door. "You need to be careful," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "What do you mean?" I asked, tightening my grip on the doorknob. He glanced over his shoulder, toward the shadows at the edge of the yard. "They've been in your house," he said. "I've seen them." A chill ran down my spine. "Who? What are you talking about?" Before I could press him for more, he turned and shuffled back to his house, disappearing into the darkness without another word. I closed the door, locked it, and checked every window in the house. His words echoed in my mind, filling me with a dread I couldn't shake. Who were they? And why had he said they'd been in my house? I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, felt like a warning. Mr. Grayson's words echoed in my mind, twisting into every dark corner of my imagination. I'd seen no signs of a break-in, no doors or windows left open, no muddy footprints on the floor, but the idea that someone had been inside my house sent a chill down my spine. The next day, I decided to take action. I called a locksmith to replace the locks on all the doors, bought security cameras, and installed them myself. One pointed at the front door, another at the back porch, and a third at the side gate. If anything happened again, I'd catch it on camera. For a while, things were quiet. The lights stayed off when I turned them off. The curtains remained closed. Even the strange smell that had lingered for weeks seemed to fade. I told myself I was overreacting, that Mr. Grayson was just a lonely old man trying to spook me for attention. But then I started hearing the footsteps. It began late one night as I was brushing my teeth. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the wind rattling the windows, but the pattern was too deliberate, slow, steady, and unmistakably human. I froze, listening, as the sound moved around the house. First near the front porch, then along the side yard, and finally to the backyard. I checked the live feed from the security cameras on my phone, expecting to see some animal or maybe a trespasser. But the screens showed nothing. The yards were empty. The footsteps stopped. I turned off the lights in the bathroom, creeping toward the kitchen window to get a better look outside. My heart pounded as I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek out. Someone was standing by the back gate. It was hard to make out details in the darkness, but the figure was tall, too tall to be Mr. Grayson. Their head was tilted slightly, as if they were looking directly at the camera mounted above the gate. They didn't move, didn't try to open the gate, just stood there, perfectly still. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling as I dialed the police. The dispatcher assured me they'd send someone to check the area, but by the time the officers arrived, the figure was gone. They found nothing, no footprints, no sign of anyone having been there. The next morning, I decided to confront Mr. Grayson. If he knew something, he needed to tell me. His warning had been vague and cryptic, but now I needed answers. When I knocked on his door, it took him a long time to answer. He looked worse than the last time I'd seen him. His face was pale and drawn, and his hands shook as he gripped the edge of the doorframe. "You saw them, didn't you?" he said, his voice a whisper. I nodded. "Who are they? What do they want?" He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes darting to the dark hallway behind him. "I don't know who they are," he said. "But they come when they think you're not paying attention. They watch, they wait. I've seen them, in your house." "How do you know?" I asked, my voice trembling. He hesitated, then stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. Against my better judgment, I followed him into the dim, musty house. The curtains were drawn, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and mildew. On the coffee table, scattered among stacks of newspapers and old photographs, was a collection of drawings. They were crude but detailed, black silhouettes standing in doorways, crouched by windows, and looming over beds. My stomach turned as I recognized the layout of my own house in several of the sketches. "I've been watching them for years," Mr. Grayson said, his voice shaking. "They pick someone, focus on them. Once they've chosen you, they don't stop. Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" I asked, anger creeping into my voice. "I tried," he said, his eyes welling with tears. "But you wouldn't have believed me. No one ever does." I stared at the drawings, a sinking feeling settling in my chest. If he was telling the truth, then it wasn't just paranoia. They had been inside my house. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I sat on the couch, my phone in one hand and the candlestick I'd kept from before in the other, watching the security camera feeds on the TV. For hours, there was nothing, just the faint rustle of wind in the trees and the occasional flash of headlights from passing cars. But then, around 2 a.m., the back camera flickered. When it came back on, the figure was there again, standing just inside the gate. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned forward, gripping the remote tightly. The figure tilted its head, just like before, and then it started moving, slow, deliberate steps toward the house. I switched to the front camera, my heart pounding as I realized another figure was standing by the porch, staring directly at the door. I scrambled to call the police, my fingers fumbling over the buttons. But before I could hit send, the lights in the house flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness. I grabbed my phone, switching on the flashlight, and backed into the hallway. My breathing was loud in the silence, the sound of my own heartbeat deafening. The front porch creaked, followed by the faint sound of the doorknob rattling. Then, from the kitchen, I heard a whisper, "You shouldn't have opened the door." I spun around, the flashlight beam shaking as it cut through the darkness. The kitchen was empty, but the back door was wide open. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the faint smell of mildew and damp earth. I ran. Out the front door, down the street, not stopping until I reached the gas station at the end of the block. The police found no one in my house that night. No sign of forced entry, no footprints in the yard. Just an open back door and the lingering sense that something had been watching me. I moved out 2 weeks later. I never saw Mr. Grayson again. His house was boarded up a few months after I left, and last I heard, it was still empty. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of those figures. The way they stood so still, so silent. And when I wake up, for just a moment, I swear I can feel them watching. I moved into the townhouse a little over a year ago. It wasn't perfect, slightly older, with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I didn't have roommates or a landlord breathing down my neck. It was a fresh start, something I desperately needed after a bad breakup and a string of chaotic years. The neighbors on my block were quiet and mostly kept to themselves, which was fine by me. There was the retired couple across the street who tended their garden religiously, a young family a few doors down, and an older man named Mr. Daniels who lived directly next door. He was probably in his late 60s, always wearing the same faded gray sweater and khaki pants. He rarely spoke, though I'd see him on his porch in the mornings, sipping coffee and staring into the distance. At first, I barely noticed him. We exchanged a polite nod every now and then, but that was it. He didn't seem like the friendly type, and I wasn't looking to make friends. But after a few months, I started to notice odd things about him. It began with the staring. One evening, as I was unloading groceries from my car, I glanced up and saw him standing at his window. The curtains were drawn back just enough for me to see his face. He was watching me, his expression blank and unblinking. I froze, unsure of what to do. Was he just looking outside? Did he even realize I'd seen him? I brushed it off, but it kept happening. Every time I went outside, whether it was to check the mail, water my plants, or take out the trash, I'd feel his eyes on me. Sometimes he'd be at the window, other times, he'd be standing on his porch, his gaze fixed on me like he was trying to figure something out. I told myself he was just a lonely old man, harmless and maybe a little eccentric. But the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. He never waved or said hello, never smiled or acknowledged me beyond the staring. It was unnerving. Then came the footprints. One morning, after a particularly heavy rainstorm, I stepped outside to find muddy footprints on my porch. They weren't mine. They were large, wider than my boots, and they led directly to my front door. They stopped there, as if whoever had made them had stood there for a while before turning around and walking away. I looked over at Mr. Daniels's house, half expecting to see him at the window. But the curtains were drawn tight. I convinced myself it must have been someone else, maybe a delivery person, though I hadn't ordered anything. I cleaned the porch and tried to put it out of my mind. But the footprints came back. Again and again, always after a storm, always leading to my front door. I started locking the screen door at night, checking it twice before bed, even though I hadn't seen or heard anyone outside. One night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, a soft tapping, like someone gently knocking on the screen door. My heart raced as I lay in bed, straining to hear over the hum of my ceiling fan. The tapping came again, deliberate and slow. I grabbed my phone and crept to the window, my hands shaking as I pulled the curtain back just enough to see. The porch was empty. The street was quiet, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamps. I didn't sleep much that night. A few weeks later, I got home late after dinner with friends. It was a little past midnight, and the street was dark and quiet. As I parked in the driveway, I noticed something odd. Mr. Daniels's porch light was on. He never left it on. I glanced toward his house, and my stomach dropped. The door was slightly open, just enough to see a sliver of darkness beyond. I hesitated, debating whether to go over and check on him, but something about it didn't feel right. I walked up to my own door quickly, locking it behind me as soon as I stepped inside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stood by the window, peeking out at his house, my breath fogging the glass. That's when I saw him. Mr. Daniels was standing in the shadows of his porch, just beyond the light. His head was tilted slightly, his face obscured, but I could tell he was looking directly at my house. My chest tightened as I backed away from the window. I didn't know what to do. Call the police. What would I even say? That my neighbor was standing on his porch in the middle of the night. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, made me jump. It felt like the walls were closing in, like I couldn't breathe. In the morning, his door was closed, the porch light off, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something wasn't right with Mr. Daniels. And I was starting to think he knew more about me than I wanted him to. For a few days after that night, things seemed normal, or as normal as they could feel when I was constantly looking over my shoulder. Mr. Daniels wasn't on his porch or at the window. I didn't hear the strange tapping at my door, and the footprints didn't reappear. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I'd misread the situation entirely. But that uneasy feeling never left. One evening, just before dusk, I heard a knock at the door. It startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I peeked through the peephole, I saw a man in a uniform holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as a utility worker, saying there was a gas leak reported in the area, and he needed to check my basement. My house didn't even have a basement. No, sorry, I said through the door. I think you have the wrong house. The man hesitated, his hand tightening on the clipboard. Are you sure? This is 514 Maple, right? No, it's 516, I lied, though I knew he could see the number on the mailbox. Something about him felt wrong, his overly calm tone, the way his eyes flicked toward Mr. Daniels's house. You should try the house next door. He nodded slowly, giving me a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and walked away. I watched through the window as he headed toward Mr. Daniels's house, but he didn't knock or even glance at the door. Instead, he went around the side, disappearing into the shadows. I locked the door and turned off the lights, my pulse racing. Something about this was wrong, and I wasn't going to wait around to figure it out. I picked up my phone to call the police, but before I could dial, there was a knock at the back door. My stomach dropped. The back door was locked. I'd checked it twice, but the sound was unmistakable. Soft, deliberate, like someone was testing it. My hand shook as I crept to the kitchen, staying low to avoid the windows. Through the crack in the blinds, I saw him again. The man with the clipboard. He was standing at the back door, but this time he wasn't alone. Mr. Daniels was with him. They stood there for a moment, talking in low voices I couldn't quite hear. My heart raced as I fumbled to pull up the camera feed on my phone, desperate to see if they'd tried anything else. But when I glanced at the screen, something didn't make sense. The cameras were off. All of them. The app showed a message, signal lost. A loud crash from the front of the house made me drop the phone. I scrambled to pick it up, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Someone was inside. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy candlestick from the mantel, and backed into the hallway. The house was silent now, the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing in from all sides. I edged toward the living room, every step deliberate, the candlestick slick in my sweaty hands. The shadows felt too long, too deep, like they were hiding something. And then I saw it. The basement door. The door that had always been locked, the one I'd assumed led to nothing more than an old utility closet. It was wide open, swinging slightly as if someone had just gone through. I didn't have a basement. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, but my legs refused to move. I stared at the dark opening, my breath caught in my throat. A faint sound came from the depths, a shuffling noise, followed by what I could only describe as a whisper. I forced myself to move, stepping closer to the door. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. No response. Just the faint, rhythmic sound of footsteps moving further below. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. I pulled it out, expecting an alert from the cameras, but instead, it was a text. An unknown number. "You shouldn't have let him in." I dropped the phone and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the end of the block, my bare feet slapping against the pavement. The neighbors' houses were dark, their windows glowing faintly with the light of TVs and lamps, oblivious to what was happening. I banged on the door of the retired couple across the street until they opened it, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. "There's someone in my house," I gasped. "Please, call the police." They let me in, offering a blanket and a cup of water as I tried to explain what had happened. The husband made the call, speaking calmly to the dispatcher while I sat trembling on their couch. When the police arrived, I led them back to my house, my heart pounding with every step. The front door was wide open, the hallway dark. One officer stayed with me on the porch while the others went inside, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. They found nothing. No sign of forced entry. No muddy footprints. No man with a clipboard. And when they checked the basement door, the one I'd seen swinging open, they found it locked, with nothing behind it but a blank wall. I moved out the next week, packing up my things and staying in a hotel until I could find a new place. I didn't look back, didn't try to figure out what had happened. But every now and then, I think about Mr. Daniels. How he'd watched me from his window, how he'd known things I couldn't explain. And how, on the day I moved out, I saw him standing on his porch one last time. Smiling.